On today's topic, we're going to be discussing pastoral loneliness. And so we're going to be talking about what it means to be lonely as a pastor. Now, as we get started in this discussion, let me ask you a question, guys. Is loneliness in ministry a biblical thing? Do we see that exemplified through Scripture?
Absolutely. I think you have time periods where you even see the men of God having to stand against these great wicked times where they do feel lonely. You know, you have even the story of Noah and his generation. It's pretty much just him and his family. And so that can be a lonely time when you feel like you're one of the only people in the city who's still following after God.
Absolutely. I think we also see that through the prophets. When we see the calling of Isaiah, right? Like Isaiah was told to go and preach, and you're going to preach to a people who aren't going to hear you, who aren't going to understand you, who aren't going to pay attention to you, or anything like that. Do we see this anywhere else in the New Testament?
Well, if you already see that narrow is the path, right? Narrow is the way.
Yeah.
If you already see the crowd whittled down to a smaller number just in those who are following Christ, and then elsewhere you have not many of you should become teachers, then the loneliness experienced by a number of pastors should not be a surprise, right? In a lot of ways, we are those with Gideon who remain. There is a large crowd, and it's been whittled and whittled and whittled. It shouldn't surprise us that we're small in number.
Absolutely. I think even Jesus at some point, he was at this isolated in an essence, where even while he was surrounded by the disciples didn't really understand the full load of what he was carrying at times. And you see that like within the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's telling them to pray and they keep falling asleep. He has a weight upon him that causes a little bit of loneliness, a little bit of isolation because of the calling in which God has given him and entrusted him to walk through. And so I think when we look at this concept of loneliness within ministry, we have to understand that ministry is lonely. It is something that pastors go through. It is something that people who are called to ministry go through because of the burden that we carry in ministry. And so it's something that we just need to realize on the front end, that there are going to be series or periods of loneliness in ministry that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, and I think it's important to just kind of jump in. I think it's important then to say to whoever's listening, whoever's watching this video, that if you're lonely right now, that's okay. Like, that's not the end of the world. That's not the end of the ministry. That doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. That is a common experience for a lot of guys in ministry, and one of the reasons why we're even doing this. Certainly one of the reasons why we're addressing it in today's video.
Yeah,
and look, what's that?
Oh, well, I was going to say, and I think it's on our hearts because each one of us has gone through a period of loneliness within ministry where we felt like we were on our own and doing all we could, and just nothing was moving, and we were the only ones who were really burdened about God's movement in our church and in our lives and things like that.
Yeah.
And if you're at a church where you're the senior pastor, the fact is the burden of making some of these choices does fall on you, and that's a lonely thing, but it has to. That's part of the job. No one else is primarily responsible for the flock, and you have to oversee that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you guys a question. As we're talking through loneliness and stuff like that, there's a question that I always hear that's asked of other pastors and things, and there's always different answers, so this is going to be different for everybody. But do you think it's okay, or in your experience, have you had success with maybe making friends of your church members? Like, is that a thing? Do you intentionally make friends with your deacons or your church members, or do you kind of try and shield them a little bit from seeing behind the curtain of ministry?
To me, I think it is important.
So when I was a youth minister at First...
I think we had a slow connection there. I don't know what happened. Sean, you go first, and then David, you're next.
All right. Well, when I was a youth minister at First Bryan, I had a lot of people that I was making and pouring into friendships that were in other areas of ministry. So other adults who had young families, but they weren't really associated with the youth ministry. They weren't volunteers or anything that way. I thought it was good to have a distinguishing mark between who's in your ministry and who your friends are. And as a pastor, that's become even more difficult than to maintain, because I am the minister over all those different areas. So I don't think necessarily it's wise to have special close friends in the church, especially if you're prone to, favor certain people over others. You do not want to be seen as having favorites.
Yeah, so I would say it's important that you're genuine with your church members. It's important that you're honest with your church members. It's important that you build relationships and establish real relationships within your congregation. But to me, there's a spectrum here where the pastor is never present with his sheep. He's never present with his flock. They don't know him. They hear him on Sunday morning, but they don't have a relationship with him. And then there's the other side of it where the pastor is just emotionally stripped bare often in order to be genuine, or in order to be authentic. I've seen guys, I think most of us could say we've heard preachers or seen preachers who have done something similar in the pulpit, where in order to be genuine and authentic, what they've done is they've stripped themselves emotionally bare, and they're very vulnerable in that moment. I don't know that that's always wise either, because to my mind, as shepherds, as men of the word, we have a responsibility to be leading people to Christ, not necessarily leading them to see how emotionally naked I can become. I'm an advocate of not getting naked in front of any church members. That's important.
I'm sorry, David, I lost this. Are we talking spiritually,
Yes.
physically? What are you talking about here?
The answer
For those
is yes.
who just came in the middle of the episode.
The answer is yes, don't do it.
Oh my gosh. I can't
Anthony, how do you feel about this topic?
I'm done. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. Okay.
How to make Anthony uncomfortable in one sentence.
Yeah. I am really uncomfortable right now.
I'm advocating not doing that.
Okay. But just to be clear,
we're on the same page.
Don't get it naked in front of anybody.
No, that's
for your wife.
That's what I'm saying. She's the only church member.
It's just getting worse and worse.
I know.
We just keep digging.
That is her special ministry.
Digging.
Okay. We gotta stop. Okay. So if I could kind of maybe make a little bit of sense out of all this, we want to make sure that we are transparent with our church members on one hand, but at the same point in time, walking into those relationships, realizing that we can't be 100% transparent with the full weight of ministry, or what it actually means to pastor a church, because they're not on the line. They don't have the responsibility of that, or the weight of that calling, or anything like that. And so it's important to realize this, because they're never going to fully understand what you're walking through. Now, it's interesting because when we look at this, we use this term, can we make friends? That term friends very broadly in this conversation. And I think there's a difference between having a friend that's a Barnabas, that's going to come up and be a cheerleader for you and encourage you and love on you and not ask for all the intimate details of that. But then there's also going to be somebody who may be more of a friend that wants to know absolutely everything about the situation. And I think there's a healthy boundary that you can draw as a pastor between those two friendships. And you got to be aware of what the defining factors of those friendships are.
Yeah. And
so
go ahead.
If you're going to have friends in ministry, you cannot complain about other church members to that church member. You've got to have a barrier there. You're not to make your friendship a time of, this person bothers me so much and I need to talk to someone about it.
Well, you shouldn't talk bad about anybody to any church member or non-church member, right? So there's a time when you can vent frustration, but you just have to be aware that whenever you're doing that, you may be costing yourself credibility and integrity and character. And you need to be aware of that when you're making those kind of relationships with anybody. So,
And I would say that part of that is the reason why having relationships, and I don't want to jump the gun, I think part of that is why having relationships with other guys in ministry is so important.
yeah. So let's jump the gun a little bit. Let's move on to this next question. Let me ask you guys, what can we do in order to combat loneliness in ministry? What have you done in the past? What are you currently doing? What does that look like for you?
So I think, go ahead, Sean.
No, I've jumped you a couple of times, so you go ahead.
I need to start raising your hands. Oh my goodness, they keep talking over each other. All right, so David, you go first this time, and then we'll let Sean answer it.
So I think in a lot of ways, I was having this conversation with my son. I have a son who's almost 18. He and I were talking about social media and how social media has really opened the door to establish networks and friendships and relationships and community beyond the flesh and bone person in front of you. And so you can expand your community, the geography of your community, and focus even more tightly on the things that you're gathering around through social media. And that can be a negative thing if you're using that as a way of escaping your immediate context, but it can be a helpful thing. I mean, even right now, I'm in the DFW Metroplex. Anthony, you're a couple hours away. Sean's in Georgia. And I would dare say that each of us have friendships with guys all around the country, if not all around the world. And so we've been able to expand the geographical area of our relationships and still tighten the things around which we're friends. And so I think it's important then that we have those relationships, that we establish those relationships with other guys on a similar journey, similar life stage as us, and then also guys who are ahead of us, who can give us wisdom and experience. I used to say we need guys with gray hairs who can give us their wisdom, and then I got a lot of gray hair in my beard and realized that gray hair doesn't mean you have a lot of wisdom. Just means you have gray hair.
No, David, I think you're absolutely right, because we get into this tendency of going, well, I live in the middle of nowhere, or I'm in a rural church, or I'm in a state that's far away from my family and things like that. And we get into this mentality that we can't reach out to guys that we've known from our past. And you're absolutely right. With the use of technology, pick up the phone, shoot off a text message, get into a text group, something like that, with other guys who are like-minded and walking through the same season as you are.
Yep.
And I got to say, this is one of the big benefits of going to seminary school and being on campus. Your friends that you make there are going to get dispersed, but they're still your friends, and you need to still be pouring into them. So that's one of the benefits that you can have of going and being in an area with other ministers. Now, if you don't have that availability to go to a school, that's fine, but you got to find a way to get community and find a way to make friends with other pastors, whether that's through your association or whether that's through, just going to other churches and saying, can we have a lunch meeting with pastors or something?
Yeah, because just as you can have that and build those relationships outside your immediate context, we as Southern Baptists, at least the three of us on this video, we have associations, we have state conventions, we have the Southern Baptist Convention as a whole. Each of those are different avenues through which we can build relationships and establish relationships and have deep friendships with other guys, again, who are experiencing very much similar things that each of us are experiencing in our immediate context.
Okay, so if I'm a new pastor here and I'm in a period of loneliness and I'm looking for guys to reach out to, I need to be thinking about previous seminary guys that I went through. I need to be thinking about my local association. I need to be thinking about other guys that are in the pastorate or on the ministry field. I need to be thinking about other convention type deals. One of the things that I network with, or I love networking with, is going to the annual meeting. Part of my favorite thing about the annual meeting is seeing the guys that are across the nation or even across the world, and being able to catch up with them and network with them and seeing how they're doing, and then continuing those relationships throughout the year. I mean, that's one of the things that just refreshes me in that.
Yeah, I often describe the annual meeting as a family reunion.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So let me ask you this. What else are you guys doing as far as, combating loneliness in ministry?
I'm letting Sean go so he doesn't jump.
Oh, good. I was letting you go, and then we were just going to have a time of silence. That's how we combat loneliness, with the silence. So other than, trying to get the friends and trying to pour into those relationships, the thing that helps me with loneliness is actually my consistent quiet time with the Lord.
Okay.
And so, having that time, I understand it's not the same as having a physical friend close, but you do have a friend in Jesus. At least we sing about it, and David's going to do that later for us. But that's important, is to see your quiet time as a real relationship.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I'll also throw on there, and it's not as spiritual of an answer as Sean gave, but so be it. Most of the conversations we've talked about as far as building relationships and friendships are with other pastors who can relate to you on that level, as other guys, as other under shepherds. I would say it's just as important, if not more important, for me spiritually, to establish relationships with non-believers in community, or even believers who are members of other churches, in community that's centered around something else. I know that Anthony has gotten me into cycling, and so hanging around guys who cycle and just ride, they may or may not be believers, but establishing those relationships with them, it's actually been to my benefit spiritually, because it forces me out of what so many pastors and professors find themselves in, which is every relationship exists within the walls of the church. Every relationship exists with believers. And so it's to my spiritual betterment to have relationships with guys who are not part of the Christian faith, with whom I can share my faith.
Right. No, I'm right there with you, David. I think that's a huge thing to touch on here, is that we have to have friendships not only within the church and not only within other pastoral circles or seminary circles, but also within our community. Because otherwise what we do is we get into these conversations where every conversation is either about a theological topic or about church. And then we get into it's this Christian bubble that we have this hard time breaking out of. And I don't think that's healthy for your ministry or your life. So if you're this person and you're going like, okay, I have a pastoral network that I work through and I have different accountability in that circle of ministry, maybe you need to ask yourself, okay, how am I getting involved in networking within my community or through my hobbies? Like, I don't know, take up cycling or take up golf or take up
running.
Whatever. Running. It doesn't even have to be exercise if you're not into that thing. I think Sean mentioned Dungeons and Dragons or some other board. Go, Sean, what was it that you mentioned?
It was a Ouija board.
I was
Yes, a Ouija board. That's right.
Yes. Look, if you can't make friends with the living, you make them with the dead.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so scared.
Oh, that was King Saul's method. I mean, it's biblical.
Yeah.
This is a great episode for theology and practicality.
And the Witch of Endor shows up again.
No, I remember when I was at my first senior pastorate, there was a community event that showed a TED Talk each week. So at the coffee shop, they showed a TED Talk each week, and then afterwards there would be this discussion. And so I went with like all my evangelism gear on, like I was coming to play. And I got there and we watched the TED Talk, and then everybody in the room was trying to lead everyone else in the room to Christ. And I realized this was a church outreach. They just weren't telling anybody this was a church outreach. Well, I enjoyed it, but at the end of the day, I didn't go back because I was trying to find a way to establish relationships outside of that context. And so that's what they were trying to build. So I wasn't the guy for them there. So I just think there's a level of intentionality that each of us have to find that meets those individual and specific needs.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I think in closing all this, we just need to realize that you're not alone. Yeah. There are people around you. And whenever you're going through periods of loneliness, You need to understand that a lot of that is it may be you just not reaching out. So pick up the phone and call somebody. Find a community event to get involved in. Go and spend some time in your hobby, whatever that looks like for you. Just get around some other people because you're not alone. Find some friends.
I found that reading caffeinatedtheology.com usually helps me break out of any struggle that I might have.
A shameless plug. That was good, man.
Commenting below videos.
Yes. We want to be your friends. So comment in below. All right.
John definitely needs more friends.
I need more friends.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, that's all we have for today. We're going to go ahead and shut this episode down. If you have any ideas on how to combat loneliness within ministry, or you have any other suggestions, make sure to put those in the comments, and make sure that you rate and subscribe to our channel so that way you get future episodes. Guys, I don't know if this episode was beneficial to you, but I hope it was an encouragement and it made you laugh. And we hope that you have a blessed day. We'll see you guys next week.
All right.